All right. So welcome to my journal club presentation titled "Friction at the Bar with Breakups." And just to make sure that we're on the same page, I just want to clarify some stuff about this title. As you will eventually find out throughout my talk, I'm actually not referring to this type of bar or these type of breakups. So to start off, I'm going to tell you something that most of you guys are familiar with, and that is TGIF and how beer and pizza get delivered via labs every Friday. So as you know, beer and pizza get delivered to the biolabs usually by the G1, G2 student host complex. However, there's been instances in which when a G1, G2 student host complex is not available, final factors and other NCT, MCO factors. So as you can see, TGIF, so delivery of beer and pizza to TGIF is a very robust process, and it can take many different pathways. So similarly to TGIF, the eukaryotic cell also has also needs food, signals, and more to get delivered inside for proper function, and it can be broken down into basically the clathrin-mediated endocytosis and clathrin-independent endocytosis. So in clathrin-mediated endocytosis, clathrin and dynamin are the key players in this process. So when you have the original invagination of the membrane, of the cell membrane to capture cargo, you have the formation of a clathrin coat around this incoming vesicle and the formation of a dynamin neck of this at the incoming vesicle, and the dynamin will bind to GTP, and it will hydrolyze it into inorganic phosphate and GDP, and by repeating this cycle of GTPase activity several times, it will eventually lead to constriction of this incoming vesicle, of the neck of this incoming vesicle, and that will eventually lead to the fusion of this vesicle. And this process can also be helped by the pushing force of actin polymerization every now and then. Eventually, when the incoming vesicle has finally been pushed up, you get disassembly of dynamin and also disassembly of the clathrin coat, so that very important cargo can get processed inside the cell. Other important factors in clathrin-mediated endocytosis are the bar proteins and the M-bar proteins. Basically, what you need to know about these two proteins is that they're made up of two monomers that, when they come together, they form these banana-shaped dimers. And these curved surfaces are positively charged, meaning that they have very high affinity towards negatively charged phospholipids membranes. And the bar proteins are known to be essential in the initial invagination of the incoming vesicle in clathrin-mediated endocytosis by binding curved membranes and stabilizing them. M-bar proteins are basically like bar proteins, except that they have these two amphipathic helices. So M-bar proteins not only will they bind to slightly curved surfaces, but also by inserting these amphipathic helices into the lipid bilayer, it can actually induce even more curvature. So now that I tell you more about, now that I tell you a little bit about clathrin-mediated endocytosis, I'm going to tell you more about clathrin-independent endocytosis. Basically, as the name implies, clathrin is not necessary in this process, and neither is dynamin. What's more, every now and then in vivo, it's been observed that you get these small invaginations that eventually turn into tubular membranes that will get endocytosed. When you try to replicate these things in vivo by pulling membranes from liposomes, you don't get any membrane breakup. So this implies that there must be some membrane binding protein that is necessary, or some other factor necessary for this process to occur in the cell. And even though there isn't a lot of information, there's a lot of stuff left unknown about clathrin-independent endocytosis. Some studies have linked bar proteins and molecular motors to this process. However, the specific role of bar proteins and molecular motors has not yet been elucidated. And this is the challenge that the paper I'm going to be presenting today takes on. The paper I'm going to be presenting today was published itself in June of last year, and it's called Friction-Mediated Scission and Tubular Membrane Scaffolded for Bar Proteins. And the main goal of this paper is to elucidate the role of bar proteins and molecular motors in clathrin-independent endocytotic pathways. To study the role of bar proteins in clathrin-independent endocytosis, the authors of the paper used giant unilaminar vesicles or goo as a source of membrane. And they incubated these vesicles, these goos, with bar protein. And then after a couple of minutes after this incubation, what they observed was that you get a remodeling of the membranes of this goo. In particular, you get these formation of tubular membranes and bar protein scaffolds around these tubules. That was a very interesting finding. However, this doesn't explain whether and how bar proteins could be mediated friction in clathrin-independent endocytosis. Before giving up on bar, the authors of the paper decided to test something else. So, instead of testing the effect of bar proteins in static membranes, they decided to pull membranes and test the effect of bar protein scaffolds in these tubules, in these tubular membranes that were being pulled. So in order to do these pooling experiments, the authors came out with a very neat experimental setup. So in this experimental setup, you have cubes as a source of membranes again, and you have a bead in an optical trap. And this bead will be used to pull membranes out of these cubes. The special thing about this optical trap is that the bead is very strongly attracted to the middle of the trap, meaning that any disturbance of this bead away from the trap will be met with that restorative force, pulling the bead back again in the middle, to the middle of the trap. So in this way, if we were to attach the scoop to this bead, if we were to attach the scoop to the bead, and then move this scoop with a micropipette away from the bead, you can actually get pulling of tubular membranes. So, using this very neat experimental setup, the authors of the paper performed different pulling experiments with and without the bar proteins being around. So, when you pull membranes out of the tubes without bar proteins added, you don't get any scission or membrane breakup. However, when you add a bar protein scaffold and you again pull the tube away from the optical trap, you see membrane scission. So that was a very interesting finding. This implies that this bar protein scaffold can actually mediate the scission of tubular membranes that are being pulled. What's more, given the use of optical tweezers, they can actually get very accurate or very precise measurements of pulling forces during this process. And they were able to record pulling forces across time when tubular membranes were being pulled out of the groove at constant pulling speeds. And they observed was that when you don't have any bar protein around, you get a very constant pulling force. But then when you add the bar proteins, you see that initially you have a very sharp increase in the pulling force necessary to pull tubular membranes at a constant speed, and then a sudden drop to zero. The sudden drop to zero basically indicates that the tubular membrane has been cut, and this very sharp increase in the pulling force indicates that the longer you're pulling these tubular membrane, the more and more force will be required to keep on pulling. So, again, to summarize these findings, bar proteins do not cut static membranes; they actually cut membranes that are being pulled. And we think that this will be due to this bar protein scaffold surrounding the tubular membrane. So, in order to study how these bar protein scaffold might be affecting the properties and the dynamics of these tubular membranes that they are surrounding, the authors of the paper wanted to do trap experiments to see whether this bar protein scaffold was limiting liquid diffusion. So the way that they did this was by having a cube with a preformed tubular membrane, And then they proceeded to photobleach only this portion of the tubular membrane. When no bar protein was added, they see a very fast recovery of photobleaching, so only after 3 seconds, which indicates that lipid diffusion can indeed occur without bar proteins. But then, when you photobleach the lipids of this portion of the tube when the bar protein scaffold is around, you don't get any recovery of photobleaching, even after 90 seconds. So this leads me to the next observation, which is that the bar protein scaffold is indeed limited to lipid diffusion across its underlying membrane. So this observation and the observation that the bar protein scaffolds are cutting, tubular members are being pulled, reminded the authors of friction. So it is in this way that a friction-driven scission of membrane mechanism was born. And basically in this mechanism, when you have a tubular membrane that is being scaffolded by bar proteins, and the bar protein scaffold is obviously limiting lipid diffusion, what's going to happen is that when you keep on pulling this tubular membrane, since lipid diffusion has been limited, you're going to get a reduction in the radius of this portion of the tube, as observed here. And not only that, but the bar protein scaffold is going to be characterized by a friction coefficient, which is going to determine by how much lipid diffusion has been limited. So that will imply that as you keep on pulling and pulling this portion of the tubular membrane, you're going to get a reduction of the radius of the tube, and you're going to require some pulling force that is going to be increasing in a proportional way to the pulling speed. And what's more, the more and more you keep on pulling, since you're going to have a reduction in the radius, you're actually going to get an increase in membrane tension of this part of the tubular membrane, and also an increase in the bending energy of the lipids making up this portion of the tube. This is basically going to make the probability of a pore forming much more likely, and this pore could form potentially across this non-scaffolded portion of the tube. And once this pore is being formed, you can get membrane breakups. So just to give you an idea of what this process would be analogous to at a more microscopic scale, you can think of a very well-cooked noodle and very highly viscous honey. So in this case, when you have this very highly viscous honey and this very well-cooked noodle, if you were to pull the noodle out of this honey, you're going to increase the tension of this noodle. And not only that, but then the honey will be opposing the movement of the noodle out of the honey. And then eventually the tension of this noodle is going to increase to the point that you get breakage. So bringing this back to the analogy of cubes and bar proteins, you can think of this honey as the bar scaffold, and then the cooked noodle that is being pulled out of the honey as the tubular membrane that is being pulled out of it. And in this kind of analogy, you can think of the absence of bar proteins as you can think of pulling a tubular membrane in the absence of bar proteins as basically pulling a noodle out of water. So now that I explained to you the biophysical model based on friction, I'm going to tell you that they were able to derive very fancy formulas in order to model their data. However, I'm not going to go into the details of these derivations, but I can tell you two ways in which their biophysical model seems to be right. So first of all, when they performed pulling experiments with the bar protein scaffold at different pulling speeds, they observed that when you have a very high pulling speed, you require a very high pulling force. But then when you have a very low pulling speed, you require an even slightly lower pulling speed. This makes sense in the context of a friction mechanism because this bar protein scaffold will be opposing the flow of lipids across the scaffold, in a proportional way to the velocity that these lipids will be moving. And if you fit their equations with this data, you can see basically like an almost perfect fit, which again indicates that their model seems to be getting these things right. So then another thing that they did, which I think was pretty neat, is that they considered 3 different bark variants with different binding affinities towards lipids. So they consider bark variants that have very high binding affinity to the lipids, and the other ones had relatively lower binding affinity towards lipids. And they observed that the binding affinity towards lipids seems to be proportional to the friction coefficient of these bark variants. In particular, they saw that when a bark variant binds to the lipid very tightly, meaning that its binding affinity is really high, you get a very high friction coefficient. And this makes sense because the tighter the binding to the lipid, the more limited lipid diffusion will be across the bark of the scaffold. So now that I've basically shown you that friction seems to be behind these bark of the scaffold scission mechanism, the next big question is whether these observations are even relevant in vivo. So the authors of the paper asked whether this friction-driven scission is physiologically relevant. In order for this friction-driven scission to be physiologically relevant, you need to have some sort of source of pulling force inside the cell. Potential candidates for this pulling force come from molecular motors. So molecular motors such as kinesin and dynein could provide the necessary pulling force for a bark of the scaffold to drive the scission of tubular members that are being pulled. So the authors of the paper decided to see what effect kinesin, which is a molecular motor, will have on this whole process. So they basically incubated cubes with kinesin and microtubules, and this is what we saw. So they basically didn't see anything, and that is expected because kinesin requires ATP for mechanical work. Then, when they added ATP to this mix, they saw some remodeling of the cube. And this can be explained by the fact that kinesin is actually pulling out these tubular membranes out of the cube. So that was an interesting finding. But then, when you add bar protein to this mix, you see fewer tubulation, and then you see these very small vesicles around. So this basically indicates that the bark protein scaffold around these tubular membranes that are being pulled are actually getting cut. So this basically proves that this friction-driven scission mechanism is physiologically relevant overall for pathway-independent endocytosis. So, in order to summarize this paper, again, bark protein scaffolds can cut membranes, can cut tubular members that are being pulled. A biophysical model of basic friction can actually predict some of their experimental data and can predict some of the physical parameters that could explain this scission mechanism. And not only that, but molecular motors could provide the necessary pulling force for these mechanisms to be physiologically relevant in the eukaryotic cell. I think this paper was very interesting and cool because of their integration of different approaches. So they use things going from biochemistry and biophysics and theoretical modeling to answer a question on pathway-independent endocytosis, and I think that was very neat. However, moving forward with research on this topic of pathway-independent endocytosis, I think we should be focusing a little bit more on in vivo assessment of these mechanisms because most of these experiments were done in vitro. What's more, given the variety of all these endocytotic pathways, I think we should be looking at the robustness of each one of these endocytotic pathways and the interplay of these processes. And then finally, I think that we should be looking into cargoes and other factors that may be responsible or necessary for this friction-driven scission to occur in the cell. And with that, I would like to thank Jack for technical support, Chris, Ethan, Ben, and Annie for their help and being great coaches as well. And I will take questions now.
Just wondering, in their in vitro experiments with the microtubules like kinesin and ATP, they see this tubulation. Is there anything else in these sort of liposomes that, or is like kinesin has some natural affinity for that?
Yeah, I think the kinesin they were using actually combined. I think it's 4 or 5. They want a specific type of lipid that this glue was made of. So yeah, but different kinesins have different, I guess like binding domains to bind different kinds of cargoes, different kinds of proteins and whatnot. But yeah, this particular one has something that combines lipids in the
What determines whether the bar protein gets recruited to the membrane? What tells it to go to the membrane? Is it like some upstream specific thing, or is it just curvature? And like anytime you have that high of a curvature, you can sense that, or you put some special lipids because of earlier factors, and then it goes after a specific lipid that's present on the tube.
I think that as long as you have membranes that are made out of negatively charged lipids, and you also have some sort of curvature, you will obtain bar binding. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, so basically like if the cell just made any tube, at some point there would be like recruitment of any bar. Like how many bars do you have in the cell? Like
there are many types of bars.
Many
You
types
have,
of bars.
and basically different types of bar proteins have different binding affinities that are depending on on the charge of the membrane that it's binding to, and also to the curvature of the membrane. So here I basically shown like this kind of like bar protein that is kind of like this, but there are also like some inverse bar proteins that kind of like bind to, I guess, like shaped differently, I guess, and then they will bind to, I guess, to different kind of curved surfaces. But yeah, I mean there are many different kinds of bars.
But you think just like the literature is like most of the specificity is just kind of the bar is looking for some feature of that membrane, or you think they're kind of regulated in some sort of signaling way where there's also like a switch where some upstream thing that pulled it tells it to switch on and do the next thing, so that it's kind of more instructive.
I don't know much about the regulation, but I mean I wouldn't be surprised if regulation via, let's say, distillation or some sort of like modification or some sort of like binding or protein might be required to prevent bar binding.
Yeah, so you don't do it too soon, for example, like you kind of don't prematurely cut it before you kind of fully invaginate it with all the cargo or something.
And this is what I was referring to again for one of the things that we should be looking at in the future, which is basically this kind of like regulation and the interplay of these endocytotic pathways. Because again, there could be some sort of like regulation behind the action of bar proteins, because you don't want bar proteins to be binding to membranes too soon, too fast, in an unregulated way. So, yeah.
But the bar proteins bind more easily. I mean, these proteins that bind lipids, it depends on the diameter of the vesicle that it's binding to. So if you have a round thing, you need a very high concentration to start the process. But if you already have a small vesicle or a tube, then it binds much more readily, because it has to do with the diameter of the object that it's binding.
Yeah. So they have intrinsic curvature sensing.
Right.
And then,
Right. In fact, you can show by looking at binding to vesicles of different diameter that you can get that result.
Yeah, and I think like also in these experiments with foods and the membranes that were pulled, you like the autopsy paper observed the French binding towards the small tubular membranes instead of like the outside of the group, because like the group is also curved, but most of the barcode is just like fine to the portions of the small group. Yeah.
So from what I understand, you need the bar proteins to localize near the junction of the vesicle. or else the bar protein is just going to get pulled along as the bits get pulled out. So like, you can't just be sensing the higher curvature around the tube, it has to be something about that junction, right?
Yeah. I assume that maybe when they established the initial binding to this tubular membrane, yeah, there could be like something about like the origin of this like that it's attracting these bar proteins there, because yeah, like when they like pull these bar proteins, they seem to be mainly localized at the base of this tubular membrane. Yeah, I don't know what exactly.
Remind me, did they see any tubulation when they had just the bar protein with the
Yes, we did. This is basically what was shown here. So yeah, if you only have bar proteins, and you'll have
at some
this.
level they can initiate this on their own.
Yeah. So the way I think about it is that this like then you can have some sort of like random chances with the ellipse and somehow you get these small perturbations, and then the bar protein might just be like binding to this small perturbation and somehow seem to follow the bar.
Last question.
Right. Do these things, do the bar proteins stick to each other? Also, you're them like a bunch of them at once, right?
Yeah, there is a bunch of them. Yeah.
And do they have affinity for one another?
I assume the charges at the surface of these things, but they have. I guess you mean like lateral interactions.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know.